reason why it's coming apart now, and why Zelensky is facing a perfect storm on three sides, is because there's been a regime change in Washington, D.C. And so, Ukraine lost support of the United States. And not only, as I've said, I've been saying this for many months now, that I had the impression that the Russians and the Americans are holding secret negotiations. I think that I had a very strong impression that there were secret dealings between the leadership in Washington and leadership in Moscow, and that at some point we're going to find out, and that all this, all these fights where Trump says, like, oh, I negotiated with Putin, but I'm very disappointed in him, and now we're going to impose big sanctions against them, and we're going to punish Russia, and we're going to furnish some weaponry to the Ukrainians. I think this was all for show, for domestic audiences, and as we're now finding out, the Russians and the Americans have of a new peace deal, which is not only going to end the war in Ukraine, but it's going to foresee a completely new security architecture for Europe, which is, a radical departure from the status quo of the last 70 years. What he's really saying is this: Ukraine didn't lose the war. It lost America's backing. And once Washington steps out, the rest is just noise. All the public drama was likely for show, while the real deal happened quietly between the US and Russia. If that's true, Ukraine's fate was decided long before the world knew it. In Washington, there's been this subtle attack on Zelensky, because overtly, they've been playing like they're friends with Zelensky, like they support him, like they want to help him. But at the same time, where's danger for Zelensky coming from? There has been this, anti-corruption investigation going on that last summer, Zelensky tried to squash it by I don't know, but in English is basically anti-corruption agency in the government. In simple terms, he's pointing out the hypocrisy. Publicly, the West treats Zelensky like a hero, but behind the scenes, they're slowly cutting his legs out from under him. And notice what the danger really is. Not Russia, but his own allies investigating him. The moment he tried to shut down the anti-corruption agency, NABU, the cracks in that friendship became impossible to hide. This isn't support, it's a warning shot. So they started this investigation. There's so much corruption that of course they found major infractions done by Zelensky, people around him. Well, particularly people around him. But it's inconceivable that he wasn't aware of it and that he wasn't given the green light to it. So this agency was controlled by the United States. That's the thing about it. And its objective was exactly the opposite. Meaning, they set it up to protect at least certain participant in corrupt practices in Ukraine. Because if you'll remember, Joe Biden, John Kerry, Nancy Pelosi, and some other American official had their children and other family members benefiting from lucrative deals in Ukraine that were completely corrupt. So they wanted to create a shield for them that they don't get exposed for this corruption. He's basically saying the corruption probe was never about justice. It was control. They found major violations around Zelensky, and pretending he didn't know is laughable. And since the U.S. controlled the agency, it wasn't exposing corruption. It was protecting certain people while keeping Zelensky on a leash. Well, now that Trump took over, now the anti-corruption police started disband them. But it was too late, because, the United States still controls Ukraine for all intents and purposes. And so, the details of the corruption investigations leaked out. They were published in Ukrainian press. People are absolutely disgusted. As a result, the Ukrainian armed forces their morale has collapsed. They don't want to fight anymore because like they're fighting and dying in these muddy trenches in order to protect a government of corrupt war-proofers. And so, we've seen surrenders. We've seen them surrender in droves to the Russian forces. In simple terms, he's saying this: once Trump stepped in, the anti-corruption agency finally started doing its real job, and Zelensky panicked too late. The leaks exposed everything. Morale that, we've seen wars in former Yugoslavia. We know that Greece and Turkey have always been at loggerheads on the verge of some kind of a nasty escalation. We know that, the Polish are deliberately antagonizing the Germans, and also the Russians. We see now, let's call it, diplomatic tensions between France and Italy. There's a lot of that, especially under the surface. He's saying Europe won't choose this new security system. It'll be assigned to them because for decades, Europe didn't run its own geopolitics. It lived inside a British-style balance of power game, where countries were kept divided, suspicious, and easy to destabilize. Yugoslavia, Greece, Turkey, Poland, Germany, France, Italy, all symptoms of the same strategy. And now, if the US and Russia rewrite the rules together, Europe won't be negotiating. It's a facade, as Ursula von der Leyen would say, like, we have unity, and everything is wonderful, but behind the facade there are many, many cracks. And the British have been brilliant at exploiting these cracks to instigate wars. And then the same thing exists practically worldwide, because, when the British left India, they made sure to partition it between Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, and that's always a gift that keeps on giving. Then you have, Turkey, Armenia. Then you have Armenia, Azerbaijan. You have Lebanon, Israel. You had Syria, Saudi Arabia, Iran. It's just the whole practically from the Baltic Sea down to the Eastern Mediterranean, and then across this southern crescent of the Eurasian continent, all the way to the Koreas. Oh yeah, the Koreas got divided also between North and South Korea. China, they carved away Taiwan. He's saying Europe's unity is just a facade. Behind it are deep divisions that Britain historically exploited to keep regions unstable. From India, Pakistan to Korea and Taiwan, these borders weren't mistakes. They were intentional pressure points designed to keep conflicts alive. The whole thing is a string of crises that are always reactivated, and you have practically permanent warfare on the continent. And so I think that if that architecture of not security but insecurity becomes overhauled to create a genuine, real peace architecture, backed by the Russians, backed by the Americans, but also by Iran and China and the whole Shanghai Cooperation Organization, then perhaps the continent might look to the future of permanent peace rather than permanent war. He's saying the world doesn't run on stability. It runs on constant, reusable crisis. A system built not for security. Russia, the US and China, Iran and the ESO rewrite that system into a real peace architecture. Then, for the first time in a century, the continent could move from permanent war to permanent peace. If you'll recall, Ukraine had a coup d'etat in 2014. And after the coup d'etat, it had a civil war because the southern and eastern regions of Ukraine didn't want to submit to the new junta in Kiev. The world is built on permanent manufactured crisis, a system designed for insecurity, not stability. And if the US, Russia, China, Iran, and the ESO replace that architecture with a real peace framework, the continent could finally shift from endless war to lasting peace. And at the same time, the Haas Western sponsors wanted to control the whole country, especially the Donbass, because it's practically 80% of the nation's GDP. So they kind of obliged the regime in Kiev to take control of the Donbass by force. And so that's what triggered the civil war I think in May 2014. In simple terms, he's saying the West pushed Kiev to seize Donbass because that region holds the real money. Coal, gas, metals, industry, almost the entire economic engine. And that pressure to take it by force is what lit the fuse in 2014. However, the United States declined to intervene. At the time, Obama was the president, and Obama said, I guess he was surrounded by some people who could use their brains. And they said, Russia has escalatory dominance in this region, so it wouldn't be good for us to get involved. We would get our butts kicked, right? So they didn't intervene. 2022, Russia struck the first blow, but Russia was absolutely obliged. They were, was provoked in a very determined, deliberate manner. He's basically saying Obama refused to jump in because the US knew Russia had escalatory dominance, meaning Washington would lose if it tried. And when 2022 came, Russia struck first, not out of nowhere, but after years of deliberate provocation. So the idea of an unprovoked attack doesn't hold up in this version of events. And then NATO, the United States under Biden administration, even Turkey might have been part of, well, Turkey is NATO. I think that they hope to create a united front against Russia. And fortunately, that didn't work out. Russia was very, very careful to not provoke a NATO intervention. So they didn't give them any pretext to join Ukraine in. Biden was there, like a piece of furniture in the administration. The game was played by the neocons, led by Victoria Nuland and Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan. And they're not necessarily a very smart people. That is, they're not stupid, but they're ideological fanatics. He's saying NATO tried to build a united front against Russia, but Moscow refused to take the bait, giving them no excuse to enter the war directly. The real mistake, in his view, was starting the conflict at all, something Obama avoided for a reason. And his criticism is blunt. The Biden administration wasn't really run by Biden, but by ideologues like Nuland, Blinken, and Sullivan. People driven more by belief than strategic caution. And their objective was to destroy Russia, to draw Russia into a quagmire in Ukraine, like Afghanistan, and then hope to topple the regime in Moscow. Many miscalculations in that whole endeavor. So that was the misstep. In the end, he's saying the goal wasn't peace. It was to bleed Russia in a long, messy war and trigger a collapse in Moscow, just like Afghanistan. But every part of that plan misfired. The quagmire never happened. The regime didn't fall. And the West is now dealing with the fallout of its own miscalculations.